Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for being here. As we approach the 10-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings, we come together to reflect on that tragic day and to share lessons learned from the emergency response. My name is Lenny Marcus. I am the founding co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative here at Harvard University. I am honored to be serving today as your moderator. Joining me is Rich Serino, who happened to be in the city on Marathon Monday 10 years ago and quickly went to the scene as the senior official from the Department of Homeland Security, where he was serving as Deputy Administrator of FEMA. He is the former chief of Boston's Emergency Medical Services and served 5 years with FEMA. Rich, we're happy to say, is now a distinguished senior fellow at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you.
Dr. Atiya Martin, who ran Boston's Office of Public Health Preparedness at the time of the bombing, and is now the CEO of All ACEs, a consulting and education firm that focuses on racial and social injustice. Thank you for being with us. Juliet Kayyem is the Robert and Renee Belfer Senior Lecturer and Faculty Chair of the Homeland Security and Security and Global Health Projects at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a national security analyst for CNN. Juliet, thank you for being with us. And finally, Eric McNulty is the Associate Director of Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative and one of the architects of swarm leadership that we'll be talking about later. So thank you for being with us, Eric. And thank all of you for being with us. If time allows, we will include some viewer questions towards the end of the program. I'd like us to begin by taking us back to April 15th, 2013, to the moments when the bombs went off and the chaos immediately followed. I want to warn our audience that this content may be disturbing to some. Let's take a look at the clip.
Boylston. A33, something just exploded at the finish line.
UCC, did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, see it. Confirming. 2 devices just went off at Boylston and Exeter.
Most of the wounded were in just total shock. They were just staring ahead, blank stares, just fear. And it was mostly the family members and other people carrying them in, and you just couldn't turn around. It was everywhere.
In total, as you may know, it was almost 300 patients were treated at the hospitals from the marathon. There were 3 fatalities at the scene, but everybody who got to the hospital survived. That's unprecedented in the world of disaster medicine. That survival is unbelievable.
We honor today the memories of 3 people who lost their lives on the day of the Boston Marathon bombings. Crystal Marie Campbell, a 29-year-old restaurant manager from Medford, Massachusetts, was killed by the first bomb. Killed by the second bomb were Lu Lingji, a 23-year-old Chinese national and Boston University statistics graduate student, as well as 8-year-old Martin William Richard from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. We honor, too, the memory of MIT police officer Sean Collier and Boston police officer Dennis Simmons, who lost their lives in the aftermath of the bombings. We hope their families and friends cherish comforting remembrances. We also honor the pain, the impact, and the courage of nearly 300 people injured in the bombings and its aftermath. Their lives and limbs were saved by a swarm of people who jumped into action despite the risks, the unknowns, and the horror of what was confronted. We wish all those affected with continued strength for the still trying roads ahead. It is incumbent upon us to reflect on the lessons that can be learned from such shocking events, so that the learnings serve to save lives, support responders, and potentially even prevent such events in the future. As you will hear in today's discussion, those lessons can be applied to a wide range of threats and events, from terrorist attacks to hurricane, tornado, and earthquake responses. How can we better prepare for and respond when a crisis hits? How can we act to save lives? How can we do better? These are the questions that we tackle today. So, as we jump in, my first question to you is, you have these events in your life that you remember exactly where you were when you found out, and I know there were connections among our panel today. So I'm just going to go down the panel. Rich, where were you? And
I spent most of the day at the finish line. Literally had left to go speak to Juliet's class that evening, and left about 10 minutes before, so the bombs went off. Left, went over to Harvard, and was actually with Juliet, and we were there not long, and we turned around and came back rather quickly in a police group.
Tia?
Thank you. I was the MIC manager, the Medical Intelligence Center manager, over at the Boston Public Health Commission and Boston EMS at the time. We were managing the special events aspects of the marathon itself. And so when the bombings went off, we had dozens of volunteers all along the tents who were doing the patient tracking of people going in and out all of the tents. We also had a number of staff members who were at the tents at the end of the race in Tent A and Tent B. And as a part of that whole process, it really was a challenging moment to transition from special events to disaster response and shift all of those systems over. And we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that. Juliet?
I was, at the time, I had just left the Obama administration where I was working with Rich and had served as the state Homeland Security advisor, so had worked with everyone here on the planning. I was back teaching in my office. I was also a columnist for the Boston Globe, and I remember the first knowledge of it was an email I got from an editor on the news side, which is rare when you're a columnist, saying, "Have you heard about something at the finish line?" And then he walks in, he's already heard a lot more than me, and then because I worked for CNN and the Globe, I hitched a ride with Rich, and then he told me I had to get out before we're at the places he had to get in. So that was it. But the memory I have is the email where we didn't know what it was, just something.
Right.
And so I live just off the marathon route in Brookline, and I remember had been down watching the race as I do every year. I was back at my desk at home, and a notice popped up on my iPad at the first about the bombings, and I spent the rest of the day responding to inquiries from our MPLI alumni and others. I was triaging between radio, television, texting Rich, checking social media, trying to confirm or at least pass along information that was somewhat reliable to our alumni around the world, because they were all wondering what's going on. How do you figure it out?
Yeah, I was in Washington giving a talk on leadership to 150 national security professionals. Yeah. And so that was sort of a moment when that lecture changed. Let's begin with preparedness. It's been often said that it was no accident that everyone who was injured that day survived. And as was said in the opening clip, that's remarkable. That didn't happen simply because of the work of that day. There was a lot that went into leading up to it. So Rich, I wonder if you could just lead us off, and then Atiya, I'll be interested in your thoughts.
Sure, it's multiple different things. It was no accident that people were evenly distributed to different hospitals. It was no accident that tourniquets were being used. It was no accident that the equipment was on scene. It was no accident that the personnel on scene, EMS, paramedics, and EMTs, treated people the right way. It was no accident because there was a system in place, and we had exercised that and planned that for many, many years. It was also no accident that, as Atiya mentioned, that the Medical Intelligence Center, the Stephen Lawler Medical Intelligence Center, was in place, and we had trained people across the board at the Diwali Institute of Emergency Preparedness. We had brought in people not just from EMS and public health, but all the hospitals, as well as the police department, as well as other fire departments. So bringing together a whole group of people long before this was the training aspect and planning for these, as we call special events as a planned disaster, and learning from each one of those to help prepare for that day as well.
Well, we'll come back to the bringing people together in a moment. So Atia, what was the preparedness? You had to do that switch right in that moment.
Yeah, so on the public health preparedness side, we really were coordinating across all of healthcare. So you think about hospitals, community health centers, the whole range of public health, and so of healthcare, plus the public health department and all of the infrastructure that is represents our local public health departments. And so, as you mentioned, the Stephen M. Lawler Medical Intelligence Center fell under the Office of Public Health Preparedness, which includes the Del Valle Institute for Emergency Preparedness. And I want to give a shout out to some folks who are actually in the space, Brian Pomodoro and Sejal Vashi, who were actually instrumental to the Del Valle Institute for Emergency Preparedness expanding its training offerings, not just for public health and healthcare, but across all of the emergency management disciplines, from public health to law enforcement to EMS, including hospitals and healthcare and public health infrastructure. So that was an important part of this. And I think the other layer is we had done full-scale exercises where every discipline in the city of Boston were coordinating in real time, in real life, what they would be doing under certain circumstances. And so practicing with the equipment, practicing actually using communications, practicing how what would happen if we didn't have access to certain things. So it was a whole broad range of preparedness activities. And then the last thing I'll say is for the actual marathon itself, that was almost like an annual test of our capabilities. We always perceived the marathon as a way for us to test our ability to respond.
Rich, I just want to pick up on something that Atia said. She talked about that preparedness. I know you had pulled together a meeting several years before the marathon bombings of experts from around the world. Could you speak to that for a moment?
Sure. In the summer of 2009, we brought together under a title, The Tale of Our Cities, and we changed it to Tale of Our City, Boston, and brought together responders from around the world. Superintendent of New Scotland Yard for the 7/7 bombings in London. We brought together a trauma surgeon from Madrid after the train bombings there. We brought together EMS chief from Northern Ireland. We brought in firefighters from, I think, Pakistan, as well as 2 or 3 other cities that had gone through bombings. And we brought together about 450 people one day at the JFK Library to go over the presentation. But to me, the most important was the second day that we had. We brought in the leaders from, again, across all disciplines, EMS, police, fire, public health, all the hospitals, as well as our federal partners in law enforcement, Secret Service, FBI, and as I say, all the hospitals. So really all the key players, and went through the policies with the experts there and sort of looked at what was discussed, what are we doing in Boston, what are we doing right, what can we change, what can we adapt, and literally change policy that day. That laid the groundwork for the trainings to continue to happen. The Del Valle Institute, which was started, as well as the MIC, was started after 9/11, that we brought people together there to actually prepare for these events, and others as well.
Juliet,
Yeah.
I'd like to call you the national make sense maker. Because you have such a role in your CNN, in your teaching, in your speaking, of helping people make sense of what's going on. And that was an extraordinarily difficult week because there was so much information traveling around. And how did you do that, or what was your week like?
It was weird in a way because, like, I knew the whole apparatus, having been on the state side, sort of supporting Boston. So the way it would work is, Boston obviously, with the finish line, with the focus, it is called the Boston Marathon. It's coordinated planning and preparedness was then aligned with all the cities from all the towns from Hopkinton that are deploying resources, and then that's sort of covered by the state apparatus of which I had been a part of. So I was very familiar with what it should look like. And also, this is my home. I'm a runner. I had run the Boston Marathon. So it had a very both I mean, we all probably experience this like oddly professional aspect to it where you're like, hey, this is my job, but also it's my home, and we know people that are running and stuff. So the role I ended up playing that week was more in I was with the Globe, as I said, was more maybe a little bit about what's been being said, just try to explain to people who don't know how the apparatus works, what it looks like. And I think that's very important. It's a role that I actually, is a part of my life now that is like an essential part of my life.
Right.
Because it can be very scary to people. It should be scary to people as it was. But also just, I often find that if you arm people with information, they can process it in better ways than if you either, as we say, it's easy for people like me to say things and make people either tune out or freak out. And so the goal is sort of, can you find that middle lane for them? And that's been a large chunk of my career since with CNN and The Atlantic now and GBH. And so that sort of, can you find that lane that gives people agency and a sense of agency in a city that's horrified, right? And have written about this, just sort of pushing back against the Boston Strong mantra, because I think I understand why cities have to do it, at Boston Strong, we're back. But I think it sort of sells us short, because it makes it sound like it's like, oh, it's just like we're tough people, but it's actually all the planning that was going on that made us strong.
Right. And so, Eric, you were studying leaders, you were interviewing leaders, and you were trying to understand what was going on that week as well as subsequent. What are some of your findings?
Well, what was really interesting was that we saw throughout that week this somewhat unprecedented level of cooperation and collaboration among those who were leading. And it was such that in previous events we had seen bursts of collaboration punctuated by chaos and conflict, right? Jurisdictions battle each other, agencies, even when they're trying to do the right thing, everybody bumps into each other a bit. We saw very little of that in the aftermath of the marathon bombings. And so we began to look at it, and as Juliet mentioned, there's been a lot of work on the apparatus and the structure. And so that had been honed over many, many years, and the planning here was a big ingredient in this. We said there had to be more than that. And I'm the amateur biologist in our group. So I walked into Lenny's office one day and I said, swarm intelligence. And he looked at me like I was a little crazy. And swarm intelligence is the study of non-human species that are able to achieve sophisticated social outcomes. So bees and ants and termites. Our late colleague E.O. Wilson introduced this notion of social biology to the world. And what I thought was there was a behavioral aspect to this. And so if we look at the behaviors in addition to the structure, might we learn more? And so we went back through our notes and we found that people talked about when they led, yes, the chains of command were working really well and there was great confidence, Boston PD, EMS, et cetera. But that collaborative piece, remember what the SAC of the FBI, Rick Delorier, said, well, yeah, we just kind of did it together. Yeah. And Tim Albom from the state police, we just kind of worked together. They didn't quite know why, but they did. And so we looked at this notion of swarm intelligence and said, might we get some understanding from our non-human friends as to why we perform so well together? We humans are a social species. We collaborate, we cooperate, and there's some natural altruism. And that's what we looked at, and that's what popped up as what we now call swarm leadership, was identifying the behaviors that help people perform really well within the apparatus and the structure.
So if you could just look at what those 5 themes were, and then we'll come back for our participants to discuss, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so we look at the different behavioral aspects. The first thing was unity of mission. Everyone was focused on saving lives. And that may seem obvious. First responders, after a bombing, they want to save lives. But the bystanders, many of whom should have run away, right? You think you hear an explosion, you're going to run. Yeah. They stayed and they helped. They applied tourniquets, they helped transport patients. They were there to help. There was one runner we talked to who, looking over his shoulder, seeing the bombing, just kept running, went straight to Mass General to give blood. And all throughout the week we heard about this, people saving lives. Law enforcement wanted to catch the bad guys so they couldn't do it again. And the second thing was generosity of spirit and action. And that is people helping each other out. And so right after the bombings, they had to decide if they were keeping the subway open or closed. One of the considerations was that Boston police and transit police were stretched so thin, they didn't have enough officers to provide security at all the various T stations. Well, General Scott Rice, a tag of the Massachusetts National Guard, said, how about if I put my National Guard troops under the jurisdiction of the Boston Police. They're not armed, but they're uniformed. They can search backpacks. That is nowhere in the manual that you do that. But it was a solution that worked. They were very generous all the way through the week, people helping each other out. Yet, as I said, chains of command worked really well. People stayed in their lanes, they did their job, they did it well, and they trusted each other to do that job. And so that kept some of the conflict away. The fourth aspect was the hard one for we humans, which was no ego, no blame. And that is the leaders we talked to quickly realized they were either going to succeed or fail together. And so there was not a lot of finger pointing, there was not a lot of credit taking. Where there was conflict, they worked it out behind closed doors to present a unified front to the public. And so we call it now emotional intelligence, but able to regulate those emotions and keep their egos in check. And finally was this foundation of trust-based relationships. And that came out of what Atiya and Rich have talked about, those years of training, institutionalizing, working across boundaries, getting to know each other. We talked to the chief in the Watertown Police Department. We said, wasn't it odd that you had Boston Police running an incident in your town? And he said, when Ed Davis, the Boston Police Commissioner, when he comes to my town, he gets whatever he wants. Because you know what? I know what teams his kids are on. He knows what teams my kids are on. We work together. That's how we do it here. And so it was that trust built up over years that then played out. So as Rich said in the very beginning, it was no accident. But these are the behavioral elements we saw that helped make that structure and that apparatus work so well.
One of the things, if I could just, on the no ego thing, I think about this a lot whenever I hear you, is it cuts both ways. It's just not just the no ego in terms of I'm in Watertown and Boston shows up. It's also, and my students know this, when you're in these spaces and first responders people are angry, they're scared. The political beast is being blamed. Why didn't we stop this? And then all the stories that come out after. And you also have to have no ego in that it's actually not personal. The criticisms and the behavior that we've seen since in some of these crises is, police chiefs making it too personal. And so in some ways you just have to say, these people are mad. My boss, the public, whoever. It's not about me, and that's a hard thing to do but Rich certainly knows people are yelling after Hurricane Sandy. They're not mad at him; they're mad that this has happened.
Right.
They might be mad at Rich.
Well, so Juliet, in addition to your work here at Harvard, you were in charge of Homeland Security in the state, as you mentioned. You were also in charge of intergovernmental relations for the Department of Homeland Security, especially during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So you've watched many instances of leaders either working together or not working together. And I wonder if you can comment on how do we get leaders to better work together? Because I think that's one of the important lessons that we want to take forward from this experience.
I think this of the unique. So we talk about what wasn't on accident. There were some aspects to this that were peculiar to Boston.
Right.
That we can reflect on now without sounding crude or whatever. Mayor Menino was in the hospital. He would die soon after. So the political alignment on party-wise aligned, city, state, and then of course President Obama was very close with Governor Patrick. Those are the same kind of foundational relationships that help, that which you obviously wouldn't get, say, in COVID. And I do, and I say that about Menino only because Ed Davis ended up being the face for the city in many regards, simply because it was a police effort, but also because of where the mayor was. And he unbelievably sort of came out of the hospital for this moment, but I think he passed away a few months later. I think it wasn't, or I don't remember how much longer, but yeah. So. So there's that weird alignment where you could get the politics all aligned, and you didn't have mayors after governors after whatever. So I think that is unique. But I do think on the politics of it, one thing that I do a lot of work with governors and mayors is to find the translators who can both represent the interest of the politics, but also the interest of the first responders. And I think Ed was probably unique in that sense. Rich, I think you're unique in that sense. You can't lead if you think, well, I'm just a first responder and the politics don't matter. We're a democracy, they matter, you may not like them. School of Public Health certainly knows that after COVID. You know, there's only so many times you can say follow the science. Something you gotta work with people in some ways, even if they don't want to work with you. And so I think about that in terms of how do you train a new group of people who are comfortable in the different spaces.
Right.
And actually, you actually bring up a good something important when you mentioned Mayor Menino.
Yeah.
So what was really interesting after the marathon bombings, what most folks don't realize is that there was a social and human services operation 2 years after the bombings to support the survivors. In the beginning, there were about 164 people who were directly impacted. By the time we finished doing research and working with all the hospitals, we're talking more about 263 people who were part of this survivor community, not just physically impacted, but also the kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, being in the space when it all happened. And so that, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Mayor Menino was very intentional about being behind the scenes. So that's why Ed Davis, Commissioner Davis at the time, was able to be in the forefront. He took a step back and he worked with then Public Health Commissioner Dr. Barbara Ferrer to interact directly with the survivors. So we were convening, the Office of Public Health Preparedness in partnership with the Mayor's Office, we were convening private events just for the survivors with the Mayor, with the Public Health Commissioner, to show that this wasn't about the cameras, and somehow we kept it a secret. I don't know if folks remember at that time, every news station on the planet was in Boston, on every corner, especially anywhere near the marathon bombing sites. So the commitment from Mayor Menino, may rest in peace, to the survivors over the course of the 2 years post the event was like nothing I've ever seen before, and nothing I have ever read about a disaster response and a mayor's commitment and involvement to the survivors. Now I know we still need to get back to the immediate aftermath, like when the bombs went off and then what happened subsequently. So I'll hand it back off to you.
Well, again,
That is part of it.
One quick point, though, following on what Atiya said, which another place where we saw this extraordinary behavior was when we interviewed Ken Feinberg. Ken Feinberg had been the special master after 9/11 and special master for compensating victims after many major events after the Deepwater Horizon. He was called right away to say, what do we do here? And one of the things he said was, you've got to create one place for the money to go. One fund became that. And you've got to be ready to distribute money quickly, because the people who have been affected by this incident are going to have immediate medical bills, immediate things they have to take care of. So you can't wait months or years to figure this out. You've got to bring money in, so make one place, and have that place be ready to push the money out to the people who need it as quickly as you can. And again, I think it was that notion of we're in this together, and let's think quickly to work together as a community to take care of people, and not just grieve over those who were killed, but let's take care of those who have survived and who are impacted by the larger event.
Including the families of the folks who survived.
Exactly, the families of those who were,
But, you know, Atiya, you and I spoke not long after, and I remember you talking about just all of the communications that were going on and the coordination that was going on from the Medical Intelligence Center. I wonder if you could speak to that as well, because we want to see all different sides of what came.
Sure.
came out.
So I'll go back to the first day. So once we transitioned, from special events to disaster management or traditional operation, emergency response operation, I had to transition command after we accounted for all of our volunteers to make sure they were safe and that they were using the buddy system and getting home, accounting for all of our staff members who had been on site. Some of them, we had them come back to the office to check in so we could lay eyes on them, kind of check them out, and many of them decided to stay and help the operation. So I was able to transition command because I was being called to the scene because we had busloads of survivors or runners who were stranded, and so part of it was also the transition to patient tracking and family reunification. So we had folks who, when you're a runner of a race, if you've never run a race, you give up all of your stuff. You give up your keys, you give up your wallet, you give up everything, so you have nothing on you. And so we had family members worried about their loved ones who had been running the race or had been watching the race. And then you had folks who didn't have any of their property with them to be able to let their loved ones know that they were okay. So we transitioned over to family reunification that first night over at the castle, which is a very large conference space that on the outside looks like a castle. And that first night was really about calming people down, setting up resources over at the mayor's office as well, because they were getting phone calls from folks looking for their loved ones. Then immediately after that, that following day, now we're talking about the hospitals and the supplies that they needed. So you're talking about 16 people who were amputated. Hospitals don't do that many amputations, and it was pretty much spread across 2 hospitals. And so we had to do a lot of coordination across all the different hospitals to move those supplies around. There was a need for blood. We had the American Red Cross in the Medical Intelligence Center, so we were able to get blood from Rhode Island rather, to bring into Boston to support the needs of the hospitals. And then we were also dealing with, in between the One Fund happening, because that happened probably about 6 months in, between the time of the bombings and the One Fund, there were immediate resources available to the survivors and the families of those who were killed. And in that time, we set up a family assistance center. And it was that we also were able to keep that a secret, which was amazing because it was in the Seaport area. And we were able to bring together the American Red Cross, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Salvation Army, the Attorney General's Office of Victim Assistance, the FBI's Office of Victim Assistance, and a number of other organizations who were providing direct support and resources to families. So for example, you're talking about they were eligible for financial benefits because it was a criminal act. And so because they were a victim of a crime, there were financial resources that then became available from multiple sources. But what that meant is that we had almost a dozen different organizations trying to offer these families resources. And so we had to streamline that whole process for them and make it easier for them so they weren't constantly being traumatized by interacting and having to retell their story and reshare all their information and all of those things. And then the last thing I'll say about this is we also coordinated with the FBI on making sure we were getting quality information to the families at the Family Assistance Center. So we would host regular briefings, have the FBI come and give them regular updates in partnership with the Attorney General's office to make sure that the families had information about what was going on with the investigation, where we were in terms of what the next steps were, and what additional benefits were available to them. All of that was happening in the background, and as we transitioned from all of those resources that were available and coordinating that. Now, the Family Assistance Center was up for about 2 weeks. We transitioned to a virtual Family Assistance Center to continue those services. So if you think about the kind of resources someone would need after becoming permanently disabled, you can't get released from the rehabilitation center, and if you don't have a safe place to go that can accommodate you if you're now in a wheelchair. Right, so now we have to coordinate those kinds of supportive services, rehabilitation coordination to do some work on people's homes if they own their homes to get it up to speed for their new disability. And if they rented, some folks we had to help them find new places to live. So these are the kind of things that were going on behind the scenes between the healthcare infrastructure and the support they needed, as well as the immediate services that the survivors needed. And one thing that people don't think about is the marathon bombings happened on tax day. So we also had to help people do their taxes. Right? So there were lots of services that happened.
Well, I think, Tia, just to pull that together, so there was a lot of coordination, extraordinary coordination, swarming, as we were looking at it, going on in so many places, in addition to the leadership. Rich, what's said about you is in your role at Boston Emergency Medical Services, and as chief of Boston Emergency Medical Services, you ran the Boston Marathon for like 2 decades. You never actually ran it, but you ran the operation. So I just, from your perch, and now you're at FEMA, you're working with the federal government, what were your observations of that day in terms of the coordination?
Well, as I wrote a short op-ed shortly after, and I said I was never as more proud of Boston EMS as I was that day. And Boston EMS, in my eyes, encompassed not the paramedics, the EMTs, the communications center, the MIC, the Medical Intelligence Center, the DeValle. It was what people were able to do that day, that they did, as we say, the right thing. But it came at a cost. It came at a cost of that it also traumatized people. Tia mentioned the mental health effects and supporting the survivors, but also the first responders. The impact that it had on many people, dear friends of mine. As I mentioned earlier, Brian Pomerleau, but Joe O'Hare as well, superintendent from Boston EMS, in the audience of the work that they did and the lives that they saved and the cost of that, I think is important. And I know the support that was given across the board to them, but it also is something I think we learned, that we had peer support, we had critical incident stress support, but we have to continue that, increase that, especially now going forward, working under even tougher conditions now with less personnel and stuff going forward. So I think that's one of the key lessons learned as well.
And I'll add to that this piece around mental health. One of the big, one of the types of resources that we coordinated were actually the mental health support, not just to the survivors, but also to coordinating responses to the hospitals who had never seen these types of injuries before, coordinating that support for first responders. So we had a U.S. Department of Health and Human Services emergency response team or disaster assistance team that came in, and they specialize in mental health, but we wanted to make sure that we paired them with the first response community, with the hospital folks, because they had experience doing that, and it's a special kind of support. Much of the peer support, EAP or employee assistance programs were overwhelmed and could not handle the type of impact that the marathon bombings had on people, and so the additional support from these other mental health resources was critical. We deployed thousands of people to sessions across the city of Boston and some outside the city of Boston for tens of thousands of people at special events, all the way to in community, like some of the celebrations, or I should say memorials that were set up for the different families and people who passed away. All across those types of events, all the way to the first responders. That was a very intricate part of the response coordination as well.
And I think there is a better appreciation for the mental health impact of some of these events. And again, the marathon experience was a bit of a change in that direction. You know, one of the other things I think that we can look back upon 10 years ago is communications, social media. Oh, it's so different now. And so, Juliet, social media had a role to play, relatively new.
Relatively new. And then we're like at a full circle now with what's going on with Twitter. I view Boston Marathon response as three different responses. So Monday, which is the one we all focus on, the sort of unity of effort and no ego and all this sort of. Then Wednesday, which is when you begin to see the focus on, okay, we have identification of who the perpetrators are, and by Thursday night, I have this right, by Thursday night, they're identified and you have the chase. And then Friday, which is not the best part of the story, right? It ends, but also you saw tremendous breakdown in all the stuff.
Absolutely.
So it's helpful to sort of do it. But in that middle part, and we take it for granted now, is the extent, there's two pieces. One is the extent to which law enforcement is comfortable using social media for here's what you need to do, we've heard about this thing, we're identifying this thing. It's very important for law enforcement to not act, or emergency responders to not to respond to concerns on social media, even if they can't validate them. The usual was, we have to vet this statement through 8 levels. Well, remember that day there was the JFK issue, JFK library issue, there were a couple of other things. and just to get the apparatus to say we are aware of this, it's nothing, we are aware of that, it's nothing, or we're monitoring it. Wednesday is now taken for granted, but it really was. I remember sitting there and watching on air and being like, I cannot believe the FBI is doing this. Like, as those of us who grew up with the FBI, where, you know, it's like not transparent for obvious reasons. They wanted to protect a case, but coming out and saying, here's the pictures, we don't know who they are, but we know it's them because they didn't turn around, all the reasons, you know, when the bombs went off, all the reasons why we knew they were, we need your help. Well, that of course expedites all sorts of stuff. It also quiets, people will forget this, the Reddit focus on innocent people, which can be very, very dangerous to them, right? So Reddit and all the sleuths online have focused on, I think, a kid in New Hampshire.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're like, you know, that poor kid. And then, okay, so that's Wednesday. And that, when I say we take it for granted, that's such a part of the way we think about how we unearth these cases. Think about the Idaho killings of those college students, you know, almost day to day, they're much more transparency in coming out. Okay, so now fast forward 10 years. We've become dependent because there's no service like it in terms of speed and chronology on Twitter. Twitter has become the tool, the easiest tool by which information is given out, but also, as importantly, in which information is absorbed. Twitter was incredibly transparent at the time in terms of what we call their API. So if you think about Turkey, the earthquake, there were people monitoring Twitter, taking the data to be able to deliver resources. So it was both a listening tool and a you evacuate, here's where family unification is, whatever. Of all the things wrong with Twitter, this is a tool that we are going to have to adapt around or away from because of its lack of reliability now. It's not, those of you who are on it a lot, it's not sequential, it's not user-friendly in the way it was. So we are at a new moment with social media in many ways as well.
I want to turn now, we have about 10 minutes left, to how were these lessons taken forward? And, you know, how are things different, better, wider perspective? And Eric, just start with you. How has Swarm leadership moved forwards with these 10
Well,
years?
I think that Swarm, and Juliet's right, it was not perfect. There definitely were times it broke down, and we should realize that as well, because that helps us understand when it works by looking at when it doesn't work. But carried forward now, though, there is much more attention to the behavioral aspect of going out to the field. So certain agencies will now take some version of those behavioral characteristics we talked about and said, this is how we want to be. Not just here's the technical capability we want to bring forward, but here's how we're going to behave. So I think that's really important. That's changed. I also think that the conversations like this are still happening is really important, because we've been studying this now for 10 years. I learned new things today. When we did a panel last week in a class, I learned new things then. What will happen as we come to the 10th anniversary is we will narrow this down to a superficial story with a few key actors, some critical moments. And that's great, that's important, that's part of it. But there's so much depth. What Tia was talking about, all that work that was done behind the scenes, that's not widely known. If we're going to carry this forward and have better outcomes in other incidents, be they bombings or hurricanes or whatever it happens, or the earthquake in Turkey, we've got to learn these lessons. So continuing to have the conversation and realizing there are ways we can tap into that collective behavior, that cooperative behavior, by being quiet, by knowing where to go and who to talk to. That's all, I think, really critically important to carrying this forward.
You know, Juliet, I'm thinking as you were speaking, we live in a more complex world now.
Yeah.
You know, just thinking 10 years ago. So how do we take the lessons from there into the complexity that we experience now?
Well, I think part of it is I think about this a lot, and is trying to unearth what we mean by Boston Strong, because I do think that sort of captures it. And you remember the Red Sox game, and the cursing and our Irish stock, and apparently is trying to figure out what does that actually mean, and how did that happen. I think you've seen some of the lessons here. So and I'm after COVID, you could think the world is unfixable, but I think it's less unfixable than we sometimes think, or even give ourselves credit for. I mean, two areas that I think that is sort of the takeaway or the sort of long-term legacy. I think one is I'll focus on Wednesday and Friday, is the crowdsourcing of intelligence. I think we've gotten so comfortable with that. That is a sea change from when I started in the field. I started in counterterrorism, the idea of going out to the public and basically you were all supposed to stay inside and hunker down, right? So, and wait until we told you it was fine, right? And I think with this idea of enlisting the community in all sorts of ways, whether it was the day of or in the law enforcement side, or actually asking them to stay put on Friday. So you think about the course of the week has been integral, right? The second, and I want to pick up on what was said about family unification. I think I do a lot, unfortunately, with school shootings, but obviously airport disasters, in other words. I think when I think about what does Boston Strong mean, I think about this idea that the work that was done did not create unnecessary harm. And I think that focus on getting runners with their families, being transparent about all of that is really important. We're now kind of used to it with the school shootings, but I do think family unification and how runners got repeat, that's something I would like to see more studies on. Like, how did that happen? Because it's very important with these mega disasters that we think about, the one thing that matters the most, which is, where is my child? I mean, that's what any parent will say is, where's my loved one? They care less about themselves, but where are my people?
So I encourage people to take a look at the Boston Marathon Bombings Emergency Support Function 8 After Action Report. It is online and publicly available. Anybody can access it because it goes more in depth with a lot of the things that we were talking about in terms of that past the 2 weeks of from beyond the first week of what else was happening and all the different players involved, which includes community, which is one of the lessons that I think is important around when we think of the swarm. It's not just government and traditional partners. You're talking about community-based organizations. You're talking about a number of folks. We didn't get into this today, but there were a whole series of equity issues happening behind the scenes in terms of resources that were provided to the marathon survivors, while communities in the city of Boston were also struggling very much because of an increase in shooting violence that happened in the city in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, and how we allocate resources to make sure that they get treated with the same love and care that we think of when it comes to a marathon bombing survivor, which gets to Boston Strong. Everyone didn't feel Boston Strong after the marathon bombings. And so for us to be intentional about what that means and how we can be working towards thinking about all the different ways that something like a disaster impacts communities. And then the last piece is long-term recovery. There's this whole piece behind the scenes, not just the human and social services piece, but when disasters, the long-term recovery piece is critical, and we are still struggling as a nation to do good with recovery planning and thinking about what structures have to be in place in order to do that well. There were businesses who were impacted by the marathon bombings, their storefronts that we had to work with in order to get resources and fill out applications and do all the stuff that they needed to do in order to get back up and running again. You're talking about a whole range of things that need to happen to get to a place where we are better off than we were before. So not bouncing back, but bouncing forward and using every opportunity to do so.
That's right.
Which I'm going to give you a tough question. From all of this, what wisdom do you take for leaders and for preparing leaders and for practicing leadership to take all of the lessons that we heard today? What do leaders need to be thinking about and doing today?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is to remember it's about people. What we do is people are affected, both the people who are responding, the people who are unfortunately the victims who passed away, the survivors who suffered either physical or mental injuries, the survivors in the community, wherever the incident happens. But I also look at what good has come out of disasters. And you have to, and from the marathon bombing, there's a number of good things. I could go on, but I'm only going to name a couple. One is something called Stop the Bleed. The use of tourniquets was taught not to be used 10 years ago by the American Red Cross. In first response, they were taught not to be used. In Boston, because of Erwin Hirsch and a few others, we always used tourniquets. That saved lives that day.
Right.
With Dr. Len Jacobs and a few other folks, we started what now is Stop the Bleed. That has saved thousands of lives since then. Also, from the survivor point of view, a group called One World Strong, which is survivors helping survivors, started from survivors of the marathon, that now have helped literally tens of thousands of survivors of incidents around the world in the last 10 years. And I think looking at it from that point of view is really important. It's about people, the survivors. There are many other things that have come out of how we respond, how we train. There's the NFPA 3000 for active shooters, bringing people together, highlighting the response, but also the social aspects and the community aspect. So as tragic as the marathon was for many, many people, look at the positive things that can come out, take those positive things and help, because unfortunately there will be another.
Eric, Juliet, Atia, Rich, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing these lessons to those of you with us in the audience. And for those who are watching, this video will be placed on the studio website and the YouTube website if you want to use it for later reference. Thanks to each and every one of you and for keeping these lessons alive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.